Charles VIII ruled France for 15 years and earned the title of most physically incompetent monarch in European history, a king so catastrophically clumsy that he fell off horses during military parades, dropped his sword at his own coronation, broke bones from routine tumbles down palace stairs, and couldn't even use a chamber pot without missing his aim and soiling himself with urine or feces in front of horrified servants. Court chroniclers documented hundreds of collisions with furniture, door frames, and floors that left him bruised and bleeding, while foreign ambassadors reported back to their kingdoms about a French king who seemed locked in permanent war against gravity itself. His legendary incompetence would eventually kill him in a manner so absurd it became the perfect ending to a reign defined by spectacular physical failure. Charles took control of France in 1492 at 21 years old, inheriting a kingdom that stood at the height of its power while personally embodying physical incompetence so severe it seemed almost supernatural in its consistency. And from his first day exercising real authority he demonstrated that neither royal blood nor coming of age could grant him the basic coordination required to navigate a throne room without incident. He had ruled nominally since 1483 when his father Louis XI died, but his sister served as regent during his minority, shielding France from the full consequences of having a king whose body seemed locked in permanent rebellion against the concept of graceful movement. The French court had hoped maturity would cure whatever affliction made young Charles trip over his own robes, walk into walls, and fall from horses with such depressing regularity, but those hopes evaporated within weeks of him taking personal power as nobles watched their adult monarch stumble through ceremonies, knock over furniture during council meetings, and drop important documents so frequently that scribes learned to make multiple copies of everything they handed him. The elaborate protocols of French court life assumed participants could perform basic physical tasks like walking in straight lines, ascending stairs without falling, and holding ceremonial objects without dropping them, but Charles violated these assumptions constantly, transforming solemn state occasions into uncomfortable spectacles where foreign ambassadors struggled to maintain diplomatic composure while watching the King of France crash to the floor mid-ceremony or fumble his crown during investitures. His attendants developed an entire infrastructure dedicated to managing his physical presence, clearing furniture from his probable path of travel, stationing servants at strategic intervals to catch him when he stumbled, removing breakable objects from any room he planned to enter, and maintaining constant vigilance that resembled protecting a head of state from assassination rather than a monarch from his own limbs. These precautions helped reduce the frequency of truly catastrophic collisions, but nothing could eliminate them entirely because Charles possessed an almost supernatural ability to find new and creative ways to hurt himself or destroy property regardless of how carefully his environment had been prepared. The throne room presented particular challenges because the elevated platform with its 3 shallow steps leading up to the seat of royal power became a notorious hazard where Charles regularly lost his footing while ascending or descending, sometimes catching himself awkwardly on the armrests and sometimes tumbling completely to the marble floor in a crash of flailing limbs and tangled robes that obliterated any pretense of royal dignity. Visiting diplomats presenting their credentials learned to expect that at some point during the audience the king would miss a step or lose his balance, and experienced ambassadors positioned themselves at safe distances because Charles had a well-documented tendency to grab at whatever or whoever stood nearby when he felt himself falling, pulling down anyone unfortunate enough to be within reach. The throne itself bore permanent damage from the numerous times he had desperately clutched it while trying to prevent a fall, leaving scratches and dents in the ornate woodwork that mapped his ongoing war against gravity. His difficulties with ceremonial objects reached legendary proportions as he dropped scepters, fumbled crowns, spilled holy oil, and let important documents slip from his fingers with such regularity that courtiers developed a fatalistic acceptance that anything placed in the king's hands would eventually end up on the floor. The ritual of receiving foreign delegations required Charles to accept sealed letters of introduction, a simple task he transformed into performance art of incompetence by breaking wax seals accidentally, dropping the letters entirely, or getting decorative ribbons so tangled in his fingers that servants had to step forward to free him while visiting nobles watched in amazement. These failures became so predictable that the master of ceremonies eventually assigned a specific attendant whose sole responsibility was standing near the king during formal receptions ready to catch whatever object was about to slip from his grip. But even this dedicated intervention couldn't prevent all the embarrassing moments when important state documents fluttered to the ground or ceremonial items clattered across polished floors while foreign dignitaries pretended not to notice. Beyond the public humiliations that undermined his political authority, Charles struggled with even more basic aspects of daily existence, and the servants who attended his private needs spoke in scandalized whispers about how the king couldn't reliably use a chamber pot without creating disasters that required immediate cleanup. He missed his aim while urinating with such frequency that the floors around his night furniture bore permanent stains, and his attempts at defecation often went so wrong that he soiled himself or the surrounding area, forcing mortified attendants to clean up waste that had ended up on walls, floors, furniture, and the king's own clothing because he somehow couldn't manage the simple mechanics of positioning himself correctly over the receptacle. These bathroom catastrophes happened often enough that palace staff maintained a permanent rotation specifically for handling the aftermath, and they developed grim camaraderie born from shared exposure to humiliations no monarch should have inflicted on his household, though they kept silent about specifics because discussing the king's inability to control his own bodily functions without creating biological disasters would have been treasonous. His relationship with horses represented perhaps his most dangerous incompetence because medieval kingship required regular mounted appearances, and Charles fell from his saddle with such predictable frequency that his riding instructors eventually stopped trying to teach him proper technique and instead focused on minimizing injury during the inevitable tumbles. He crashed to the ground during military reviews where he was supposed to inspect troops while projecting martial authority, during hunting expeditions where he was expected to chase game alongside nobles, and during ceremonial processions through cities where thousands of citizens gathered to see their king ride past in majesty but instead witnessed him toppling from his mount in a graceless heap that required guards to rush forward and help him back into the saddle. His horses sensed his instability and responded nervously to his unbalanced weight, creating a feedback loop where his poor riding made the animals skittish, which in turn made maintaining his seat even more difficult until eventually something spooked the horse or Charles shifted wrong and gravity claimed another victory. Charles decided in 1494 to invade Italy and claim the Kingdom of Naples, launching a military campaign that would demonstrate his clumsiness operated equally well across international borders and that foreign architecture posed the same hazards as French palaces. The decision to pursue military glory in Italy came from political calculation and dynastic ambition rather than any realistic assessment of whether Charles personally possessed the physical capability to lead an army across the Alps and down the Italian peninsula without falling off his horse every few miles. But medieval kings didn't let minor considerations like catastrophic personal incompetence interfere with grand strategic visions. The logistics of moving thousands of soldiers, horses, artillery, and supplies through mountain passes and across unfamiliar terrain were complicated enough without adding a monarch who needed constant supervision to prevent self-injury. But the French military command had years of experience managing their king's limitations, and they approached the Italian campaign with the same mixture of professional competence and resigned acceptance that characterized everything involving Charles's physical presence. The march through the Alps gave Charles immediate opportunities to demonstrate that his talent for falling worked just as well on mountain paths as on palace floors, and he managed to slip on icy trails, trip over rocks, lose his balance on narrow bridges, and generally transform routine travel into a series of near-death experiences that had nothing to do with enemy action and everything to do with his comprehensive inability to navigate terrain more challenging than flat ground. His commanders learned to factor in extra time for any movement that required the king to mount a horse or traverse difficult landscape, and they positioned guards specifically to catch him during the inevitable moments when his feet went out from under him or his saddle tilted at the wrong angle, creating a traveling safety net that followed Charles through hostile territory, protecting him primarily from himself rather than Italian soldiers. The army's progress slowed noticeably whenever the king actually accompanied the column because his presence required constant vigilance and frequent stops to deal with whatever minor disaster he had just created through his latest collision with the physical world. The Italian cities that Charles conquered found themselves dealing with a conqueror who looked less like a fearsome military leader and more like someone who needed medical attention, and his triumphal entries into Florence and Rome were marred by his near falls from horseback, his visible struggles to remain upright during processions, and his unfortunate tendency to knock over ceremonial objects during victory celebrations. The Florentines watched in amazement as the King of France entered their city wobbling precariously in his saddle while guards rode close on either side ready to catch him if he started to tumble, and Roman observers noted that Charles walked with such obvious unsteadiness during his visit to the Vatican that he appeared drunk despite being completely sober. These Italian witnesses had expected to see a powerful monarch whose military might had overwhelmed their defenses, but instead they encountered someone who seemed more threatened by staircases and doorframes than by enemy armies, creating a strange disconnect between French military success and the physical incompetence of the king who theoretically commanded those victorious forces. The siege and capture of Naples in February 1495 represented the high point of Charles's campaign and should have been his moment of triumph, but even this victory was undermined by his inability to navigate the conquered city without incident. He fell downstairs in the royal palace while touring his new domain, knocked over expensive artwork while walking through galleries, tripped over his own ceremonial sword during the victory banquet, and generally created chaos that made Neapolitan nobles wonder how someone this clumsy had managed to conquer anything beyond his own palace corridors. The celebrations were further complicated when Charles attempted to use a chamber pot in his new quarters and somehow managed to miss so completely that he urinated on the floor and partially on himself, forcing his embarrassed attendants to clean up the mess while trying to maintain the fiction that their king possessed basic control over his bodily functions. The retreat from Naples that followed diplomatic complications and military pressure from Italian coalitions gave Charles additional chances to demonstrate that his clumsiness posed as much danger to French success as enemy soldiers, and the withdrawal back across Italy involved navigating the same difficult terrain he had struggled with on the way south, except now he faced the added pressure of conducting a strategic retreat while avoiding capture or defeat in battle. He fell from his horse multiple times during the withdrawal, creating moments of panic among his commanders who worried their king would get killed not in combat but from hitting his head on a rock after tumbling from the saddle. And his physical struggles during the retreat became so severe that at one point his officers seriously discussed whether they should tie him to his horse to prevent him from falling at a critical moment when they couldn't afford to stop and help him remount. Charles returned to France in late 1495 without the Kingdom of Naples but with his throne secure and his reputation for military ambition established, though his reputation for physical incompetence had only grown stronger during the Italian adventure. He settled back into managing France with the same combination of reasonable political judgment and catastrophic personal clumsiness that had characterized his earlier years of personal rule, and life at court resumed its familiar rhythm of state business interrupted regularly by the sound of their king crashing into something or tumbling to the floor during routine activities. The Italian campaign had aged him and left him even more prone to illness and injury than before, but it hadn't taught him any lessons about spatial awareness or self-preservation, and he continued navigating palaces and public spaces with the same oblivious confidence that had resulted in countless collisions throughout his life. The Château of Amboise became his primary residence after Italy, a beautiful Renaissance palace that featured the same architectural hazards that had plagued Charles everywhere he lived, including stone doorways with low lintels designed for medieval proportions rather than modern comfort, narrow corridors with unexpected turns, and staircases that required attention and careful footing to navigate safely. Charles had lived at Amboise during his childhood and should have known every dangerous threshold and tricky step in the building, but familiarity with a space had never prevented him from walking into walls or missing his footing on stairs, and the palace staff maintained the same vigilant attention to his movements that had become standard practice wherever he resided. His daily routines involved moving between his private chambers, council rooms, dining halls, and reception areas, following paths he had walked thousands of times but still managed to traverse with the uncertainty of someone exploring hostile territory filled with invisible traps. On April 7, 1498, Charles spent the afternoon preparing to watch a tennis match in the palace grounds, a leisure activity that would require him to walk from the royal apartments through a covered gallery and down to the courts where he could observe the game from a safe seated position that minimized opportunities for embarrassing falls. The route he needed to take involved passing through a doorway in the gallery that connected the residential wing to the entertainment areas, a doorway he had walked through hundreds of times before without incident because despite his general clumsiness he occasionally managed to navigate familiar spaces successfully through sheer repetition and luck. The doorway was lower than modern standards, built during an earlier century when people were shorter and architectural proportions reflected different assumptions about human height. But it wasn't dangerously low by medieval standards, and thousands of people had passed through it over the decades without striking their heads or requiring medical attention afterward. Charles approached the doorway with his usual lack of attention to his surroundings, walking at a pace that wasn't particularly fast but also wasn't cautious, and he failed to lower his head or slow down as he reached the threshold, resulting in his forehead striking the stone lintel with enough force to stop his forward momentum and send him stumbling backward. The impact wasn't immediately catastrophic in the way that falling from a horse or downstairs might have been, and Charles remained conscious and able to stand after the collision, but observers noted that he looked stunned and disoriented in a way that went beyond simple surprise at having walked into something. His attendants rushed forward to check on him and saw blood on his forehead where the stone had split the skin, but head wounds bled dramatically even when they weren't serious, and the injury initially seemed like just another addition to Charles's extensive collection of bruises, cuts, and scars accumulated from a lifetime of colliding with the built environment. Charles brushed off the concern of his servants and insisted on continuing to the tennis match because he had survived worse falls and collisions throughout his life and saw no reason to let a minor bump on the forehead interfere with his afternoon entertainment. And the attendants who accompanied him noticed that he seemed slightly unsteady but attributed this to his normal lack of coordination rather than any specific injury from the doorway collision. He watched the tennis match for approximately an hour, sitting in a chair that prevented him from falling but also prevented anyone from noticing that his condition was deteriorating beyond his usual baseline of physical incompetence. And when the match concluded he stood up to return to his chambers and immediately collapsed to the ground in full view of the assembled courtiers who had been laughing moments before at the athletic competition. The physicians who rushed to examine the fallen king discovered that he had lost consciousness and couldn't be roused, and they recognized immediately that something had gone catastrophically wrong inside his skull from the seemingly minor impact with the doorway. Medieval medicine had limited understanding of traumatic brain injury and no ability to relieve the pressure building inside Charles's head as blood pooled in spaces where it didn't belong, and the doctors could do nothing except keep him comfortable and wait to see if he would regain consciousness or slip away. Charles lingered for several hours in a state of unconscious oblivion that might have been merciful given his lifelong awareness of his own physical inadequacy, and as the afternoon light faded through the palace windows the King of France died without waking up, killed at age 27 by the same enemy that had tormented him throughout his life, his own inability to navigate physical space without injuring himself. The official announcement of Charles's death described it as a tragic accident that could have happened to anyone. But everyone who had lived around him knew the truth. This wasn't random misfortune but rather the inevitable conclusion of a life spent in constant physical warfare with the material world. He had survived countless worse falls and collisions that should have killed him, only to die from the relatively minor impact of walking into a doorway he had passed through countless times before, as though fate had been saving the final irony for last. His death created immediate political crisis as he had no surviving children to inherit the throne, forcing France to navigate a succession that ended the direct Valois line and brought the Orleans branch to power under Louis XII, but the succession troubles felt almost appropriate given that Charles had managed to make even his death complicated through the absurd circumstances of its occurrence. The aftermath of Charles's death saw France transition smoothly enough to new leadership despite the awkward succession, but the circumstances of how he died guaranteed that his reputation would emphasize physical incompetence over any political or military achievements he had managed during 15 years on the throne. Foreign courts that received news of his death from walking into a doorway reacted with responses ranging from sympathy to barely concealed amusement, and diplomatic correspondence from the period shows ambassadors struggling to describe the event in terms that respected the gravity of a royal death while acknowledging the absurdity of a monarch being killed by architecture he should have easily avoided. The Italian states that Charles had briefly conquered felt vindicated that the clumsy king who had stumbled through their cities had ultimately been defeated not by their armies but by a stone lintel, while Spain and England noted the manner of his death in their official records with language that conveyed amazement that someone this physically incompetent had survived to adulthood at all. The courtiers and servants who had spent years managing Charles's clumsiness and protecting him from himself felt a mixture of sadness at his death and relief that they would no longer need to maintain constant vigilance against the next inevitable collision. And the stories they told about him after his death emphasized the sheer consistency and creativity of his physical incompetence rather than dwelling on whatever positive qualities he might have possessed as a ruler. The catalogue of his falls, crashes, spills, and collisions became the primary content of his historical legacy, overshadowing his Italian campaign, his administrative reforms, and his patronage of arts and architecture, because people found his physical failures more memorable and entertaining than his political successes. His inability to use a chamber pot without creating disasters became a particular favorite anecdote among those who had witnessed or cleaned up after these incidents, and the stories of him soiling himself or missing his aim so completely that waste ended up on walls and furniture passed into palace legend as examples of how spectacularly ungraceful even a king could be. Modern historians examining Charles's reign struggle to balance his genuine accomplishments against the overwhelming evidence of his physical incompetence, and most accounts end up emphasizing the absurdity of his clumsiness because the documentation of his falls and collisions is more detailed and entertaining than the records of his policy decisions. He ruled during a significant period of French history when the kingdom was consolidating power and beginning its competition with Spain for European dominance, and his Italian campaign demonstrated French military capability even if his personal leadership was compromised by his inability to stay on a horse. His patronage of Renaissance art and architecture brought Italian influences to France and helped transform the aesthetic sensibilities of the French court, though these cultural contributions are often overshadowed by the fact that he couldn't walk through the beautiful spaces he commissioned without crashing into the furniture. The manner of his death ensured he would be remembered primarily as the king who was killed by a doorway, and this reputation for dying in the most absurdly preventable way possible attached itself permanently to his historical legacy regardless of whatever else he accomplished during his life. European courts used his death as a cautionary tale about paying attention to one's surroundings and an example of how even the powerful could be brought down by trivial accidents, though the moral of the story was somewhat undermined by the fact that Charles had spent his entire life demonstrating that paying attention to his surroundings made no difference to his ability to avoid colliding with things. His name became synonymous with physical incompetence in a way that few other monarchs achieved, and references to having a Charles VIII moment entered in formal court vocabulary as a way to describe embarrassing falls or collisions without directly insulting whoever had just walked into a wall or knocked over furniture. The physical spaces where Charles lived and died remained standing for centuries after his death, and visitors to Amboise can still see the gallery where the fatal doorway stood, though the specific lintel that killed him has been modified or replaced in subsequent renovations that made the passage safer for people of varying heights. The other palaces where he stumbled through his reign bear no specific markers of his countless collisions, but the servants' quarters and private areas still contain floors that bear stains from his bathroom mishaps and woodwork that shows scars from his desperate grabbing during near falls, physical evidence that remains visible even as the specific stories of individual incidents have faded from memory. These traces of his physical presence serve as reminders that Charles VIII existed as a real person who struggled with genuine limitations rather than as a comic character invented for entertainment. Though the line between tragic incompetence and absurd humor remains difficult to draw when examining a life that contains so many moments that would be funny if they hadn't caused real pain and humiliation to someone who couldn't escape the body he inhabited or the role he was forced to play, despite being so obviously ill-suited for its physical demands.